Chapter 3. The Discovery. Presenting the complete ontological psychology of selfhood. 7. The architecture of selfhood, an ontological psychology. 7.1. The necessity of a new framework. The preceding sections have accomplished the negative task of the book with logical completeness. The subject of experience cannot be located in any part of any system at any scale of reality. Neuroscience cannot find it in the brain. Philosophy cannot locate it in the contents of experience. AI demonstrates that functional sophistication without a verifiable subject is entirely possible, making selfhood irreducible to functional architecture. The quantum vacuum, atomic interiority, nested consciousness, and the informational nature of reality all converge on the conclusion that consciousness is the ground of reality rather than its product, and that the subject of experience must be sought at the level of the whole rather than among the parts. What the preceding sections have not yet provided is a positive, architecturally precise account of how the subject of experience is structured within the human person, how it operates moment to moment, how it generates the specific qualities of experience associated with different psychological states, and how it relates to the infinite consciousness that the preceding sections have established as the ultimate ground of all reality. This positive account is the task of the present section. The framework presented here is grounded in Wahdat al-Khayal, unity of thought, which provides the most complete existing account of the ontological architecture of human selfhood. It is presented as an ontological psychology because it treats the self not as a social construct, a narrative production, a neural correlate, or a functional system, but as an ontological reality with a precise structure, a specific relationship to the ground of all existence, and a determinate role as the immediate channel of all human psychological activity. The framework is not presented as one theoretical option among many. It is presented as the logically necessary architecture given everything established in the preceding sections. The only account of selfhood that satisfies all the requirements that the failure of existing approaches has specified. 7.2. The critical distinction, person, self, and I. Three terms that are consistently conflated in psychology and philosophy of mind refer to three ontologically distinct realities. Their conflation is not merely terminological imprecision. It is the source of the most fundamental confusions that have prevented both disciplines from resolving the question of the ultimate subject of experience. Establishing the distinction with precision is therefore not a preliminary technicality, but a substantive philosophical contribution. The person is a localized thought of infinite consciousness, a code, an informational structure within the infinite mind, given a psyche to perceive itself as distinct. The person is not a material entity. As Section 6 established, there is no material in any ultimate sense. Everything that appears material is a surface encoding of consciousness. The person is a thought appearing material from within its own perspective, but having no material existence independent of the consciousness that thinks it. The person is the complete human being considered as an ontological unit, body, psyche, and real self together. It is what infinite consciousness thinks when it thinks a human being into existence. The self is the sense of existence, awareness, and being of that person. The self is not the person. It is the person's mode of being present to itself, the interiority of the person's existence rather than its exteriority. The self has a specific architecture, a four-layered structure, and a dynamic character, a continuous movement between layers that the present section will describe in detail. The self is what asks the question, who am I? It is the ground of all first-person experience, the one for whom the person's life is undergone rather than merely occurring. It is what the philosophical tradition has been searching for under the names transcendental subject, pure ego, and phenomenal consciousness, without recognizing its specific ontological structure. The I is the individual person as agent in the world, the first-person grammatical and phenomenological center of ordinary experience, the apparent unified agent that speaks, acts, decides, and navigates the social and physical environment. The I is the product of the outer self's processing, the construction that the brain produces of the person as a unified social agent with a specific identity, history, relationships, and projects. It is real as a construction. It is not the ultimate subject. It is the surface encoding of the self's deeper reality, the most accessible face of the person's inner architecture. These three are ontologically distinct in a precise and logically consequential way. The person is the whole, body plus psyche plus real self. The self is the inner architecture of the person's being, the four-layered structure through which infinite consciousness localizes itself within the person. The I is the construction produced by the outermost layer of that architecture for the purposes of social navigation and environmental engagement. Neuroscience has been studying the brain of the person, specifically the neural substrate of the outer self's construction of the I, while looking for the self. Philosophy has been examining the logical and phenomenological structure of the I, the first-person perspective of ordinary experience, while looking for the self. Neither has recognized that the self is a distinct ontological category, neither the person nor the I, with its own architecture, its own dynamics, and its own relationship to the infinite consciousness that is the ultimate subject of all experience. 7.3. The structure of the psyche. The psyche is the personal dimension of the person, distinct from its divine dimension, which is the real self. The psyche is what existing psychology has studied under the names mind, psyche, and mental life. It is the domain of thoughts, feelings, memories, desires, perceptions, intentions, and all other psychological events that constitute the content of a human life. Yet existing psychology has studied the psyche without recognizing its full ontological structure, treating it as though it were either identical with the brain, a product of neural processing, or a purely social construction shaped entirely by cultural and interpersonal experience. The present framework locates the psyche within a larger ontological structure that existing psychology has not recognized. The psyche is not confined to the brain. It flows throughout the entire body and beyond it into the empty space that is the medium of infinite consciousness. The mind does not end at the skull. It permeates the biological organism entirely and extends beyond its physical boundaries into the field of infinite consciousness, within which the person exists as a localized thought. Certain areas of the human body can be understood as connection points to the energetic fields of infinite consciousness, through which the different layers of the psyche express themselves most directly. But these connection points are not locations where the psyche is housed. They are interfaces through which the psyche's different layers communicate with the physical substrate of the person. Within the psyche, there exist 3 layers of awareness, each with its own self, its own nature, its own bodily connection, its own form of intelligence, and its own domain of psychological health and illness. The unconsciousness is the deepest layer of the psyche. It came into existence with the creation of the human being as a species and is programmed and safeguarded from before the birth of each individual, becoming intertwined with the mind of the fetus at the inception of biological life. It is intertwined with the DNA of the individual, encompassing the fundamental coding that governs the entirety of their biological existence, including all the scripts that guide their actions throughout their lifetime. It also orchestrates all the biological functions of the human body according to its pre-established programming. The unconsciousness is connected to the heart as its primary bodily interface, representing the deep realm of hidden motivations and biological imperatives that operate entirely below the threshold of conscious awareness. The subconsciousness operates even before the birth of the individual, its functionality preceding physical existence, and initiates active operation immediately upon the advent of biological life in the fetus. It primarily houses the repository of human emotions, which serve as the foundation for all behaviors manifested throughout the person's lifespan. The inner self and the ideal self reside within the subconsciousness, connected to the emotional and hormonal centers of the body. The subconsciousness is the layer at which the most fundamental human motivations, emotional drives, moral aspirations, and deep desires operate, shaping behavior from below the threshold of conscious deliberation. The exploration, experience, and appropriate expression of the emotions housed in the subconsciousness is of fundamental importance for psychosocial well-being. The consciousness begins to operate when the human being enters the world, initially in a state akin to a blank canvas awaiting the infusion of schemas through socialization. These schemas, the cultural values, social norms, linguistic frameworks, and interpersonal patterns that the developing person absorbs from their environment, progressively populate the consciousness and shape the individual's perception of reality, their beliefs about themselves and the world, and their behavioral repertoire. The outer self resides within consciousness, connected primarily to the brain as its bodily interface. The consciousness is the layer most familiar to ordinary introspection and most extensively studied by neuroscience and cognitive psychology. It is also, paradoxically, the layer most vulnerable to psychopathology, because its schema-based construction of reality can be distorted by faulty socialization, cultural pathology, and the accumulation of maladaptive beliefs. The 3 layers of awareness are not separate compartments. They are nested levels of a single continuous field of awareness, each more encompassing than the one above it in the containment architecture. The consciousness is the most surface level, the most recently developed, the most culturally shaped, and the most distant from infinite consciousness. The subconsciousness is deeper, older, more universal across individuals, and closer to the ground of human nature that all persons share. The unconsciousness is the deepest, most ancient, most universal, and most intimately connected to the biological coding that links the individual to the history of the species, and ultimately to the creative activity of infinite consciousness that programmed that coding from the beginning. 7.4 The 4 selves, their natures, and their intelligences. Within the 3 layers of the psyche, 3 selves reside, each with its own distinct nature, its own bodily connection, and its own form of intelligence. Together with the real self, which exists outside the psyche at the boundary between the person and infinite consciousness, these constitute the four selves of the complete human person. The outer self, also referred to in earlier psychological literature as the ego or social self, resides within the consciousness layer and is expressed primarily through the brain. It carries the second nature of the human being, a learned nature that varies from person to person, shaped by the specific cultural, social, and interpersonal environment in which the person develops. The second nature is not given at birth. It is constructed through the process of socialization, through the accumulation of cultural schemas, social roles, linguistic identities, and interpersonal patterns that the developing person absorbs from their environment. The outer self is the self that presents itself to the world, that navigates social relationships, that constructs and maintains the social persona through which the person is known to others. It generates four forms of intelligence: cognitive intelligence, the capacity for logical reasoning, problem-solving, and the manipulation of abstract knowledge; social intelligence, the capacity for understanding and navigating social relationships with competence and autonomy; environmental intelligence, the awareness of environmental conditions and their impact on personal and collective well-being; and religious intelligence, the capacity to validate and engage with religious or ultimate concern frameworks through authentic critical inquiry. Each of these intelligences determines the health or illness of its corresponding domain: cognitive health or illness, social health or illness, environmental health or illness, and religious health or illness. The inner self, referred to in earlier psychological literature as the id or personal self, resides within the subconsciousness layer and is expressed through the emotional and sexual centers of the body, particularly the hormonal and glandular systems that regulate emotional and sexual functioning. It carries the first nature of the human being, the emotional and instinctual nature that is shared by all human beings regardless of culture, history, or socialization. The first nature is given at birth. It is the universal human substrate of emotional life, the layer at which all human beings share the same fundamental emotional drives, relational needs, and instinctual orientations, regardless of the cultural differences that shape their outer selves. The inner self is the self that feels most directly, most immediately, and most urgently. It is the seat of appetite, desire, emotional attachment, and the fundamental need for connection and gratification that drives human behavior from below the level of conscious deliberation. It generates two forms of intelligence: sexual intelligence, the capacity to perceive, comprehend, and ethically respond to one's own and others' sexual needs within personal and socio-cultural contexts; and emotional intelligence, the capacity to express and regulate emotions with skill, deriving both intrinsic emotional satisfaction and extrinsic emotional connection from one's affective life. These determine sexual health or illness and emotional health or illness, respectively. The ideal self, referred to in earlier psychological literature as the superego or desired self, also resides within the subconsciousness layer and is expressed primarily through the heart as its bodily interface. It carries the pre-nature of the human being, the aspirational and moral nature that orients the person toward ethical values, higher purposes, and the cultivation of character. The pre-nature develops in a broadly similar way across individuals, shaped by the moral and religious frameworks of the culture in which the person grows up, but oriented in all cases toward the aspiration to be good, to act rightly, and to align one's life with values that transcend immediate self-interest. The ideal self is the self that evaluates, appreciates, and aspires. It is the internal moral witness that registers whether the person's actions, desires, and choices align with their deepest values. It does not argue or prohibit. It evaluates and responds with appreciation when the person acts well, and with discomfort when the person acts badly. It generates moral intelligence, the capacity to discern right from wrong based on universal humanistic virtues, making ethical judgments that transcend both cultural relativism and blind obedience to authority. This determines moral health or illness. The real self, referred to as the divine self, occupies a position in the ontological architecture that is categorically different from the other three selves. It does not reside within the psyche. It exists at the boundary between the person and infinite consciousness, partially outside the enclosed personal psychological system, at the interface between the finite person and the infinite ground. It carries the para-nature of the human being, the divine nature, the nature that both the person and the creator aspire toward, the nature that is most fully realized when the person lives in maximum alignment with the ground of its own being. The real self is expressed through the eyes, which in many traditions across human culture have been recognized as the windows to the soul, reflecting the depth of consciousness behind the social persona. It is above spatial, temporal, and physical limitations. The entire universe resides within the real self, because the real self is imbued with infinite consciousness, which is the ground of all spatial, temporal, and physical reality. The real self generates spiritual intelligence, the capacity to experience higher states of consciousness, transcend ego boundaries, recognize the interconnectedness of all existence, and engage with the ground of being that underlies all apparent multiplicity. This determines spiritual health or illness, which is not merely one domain of well-being among others, but the domain most directly reflecting the quality of the person's relationship with infinite consciousness, the ultimate ground of their existence. The containment architecture of the four selves reveals a spatial logic of profound significance. The outer self is the most enclosed, the most interior in the containment structure, the furthest from infinite consciousness in the architecture of the person. The real self is at the outermost boundary, the most exposed to the infinite ground, the least enclosed within the personal psychological system. This is the opposite of what ordinary spatial intuition might suggest. The social surface of the person, the outer self with its cultural schemas and social persona, is actually the most interior, the most cut off from the infinite ground. The deepest self, the real self, is the most exterior, the most open to the infinite field within which the person exists. The journey from outer self-dominance to real self-dominance is therefore not a journey inward in the conventional sense. It is a journey outward, through the layers of the psyche toward the boundary with infinite consciousness. 7.5. The introspective and conflict-based proof of multiple selves. A question must be addressed explicitly that the method of exhaustive elimination requires. Why 4 selves rather than any other number? The answer follows directly from the logical structure established in the preceding 6 sections and is therefore not arbitrary but necessary. The argument proceeds as follows. the person consists of two fundamental ontological components: a connection to infinite consciousness, which is the real self, and a personal psychological dimension, which is the psyche. This two-part structure is not a theoretical preference. It is the minimum architecture required to account for two undeniable features of human experience: the fact that human beings have a personal, bounded, individual experiential perspective, which requires the psyche, and the fact that human beings have access to dimensions of experience that transcend personal history, cultural conditioning, and biological constitution, which requires a connection to something beyond the personal psyche, namely the real self at the boundary with infinite consciousness. These two requirements establish that the minimum adequate architecture must include at least two components, one personal and one transpersonal. A single self-model satisfies neither requirement adequately. It either collapses the transpersonal into the personal, producing a closed system with no connection to the infinite ground, or it collapses the personal into the transpersonal, eliminating the particular bounded perspective that gives the person its individual experiential character. Within the personal psyche, the preceding sections established three independent requirements that the architecture must satisfy simultaneously. It must account for the unconscious biological and pre-programmed dimensions of human experience that operate entirely below the threshold of conscious awareness and are connected to the body's deepest regulatory systems, establishing the necessity of the unconsciousness layer and its associated inner self. It must account for the moral and aspirational dimensions of human experience that operate below conscious deliberation, but above biological instinct, oriented toward values and ethical evaluation that neither the biological substrate nor the social construction of the outer self generates, establishing the necessity of the subconsciousness layer and its associated ideal self. And it must account for the socially constructed, culturally shaped, and consciously deliberating dimension of human experience through which the person navigates the social and physical world, establishing the necessity of the consciousness layer and its associated outer self. Three layers within the psyche, each independently established by a specific and irreducible feature of human psychological experience, plus the real self at the boundary with infinite consciousness, yields precisely four selves. A model with fewer than four selves cannot simultaneously satisfy all four independently established requirements. A model with more than four selves would require demonstrating additional irreducible features of human psychological experience beyond the four that the preceding sections have established, and no such additional features have been identified in the literature across the four disciplines the book surveys. This four-part structure also finds precedent, though never before assembled into a single unified ontological architecture across the history of psychology itself. Freud's 1923 tripartite model of id, ego, and superego established over a century ago that a single unified self is inadequate to account for the internal structure of the psyche, that psychological life requires multiple distinguishable layers operating according to different logics and serving different functions. James's 1891 account of the self as material, social, and spiritual, and Rogers's 1961 later distinction between the real self and the ideal self, extended this multiplicity further, recognizing dimensions of selfhood tied to social presentation, aspirational identity, and an inner, more essential sense of being, dimensions that closely anticipate, without fully articulating, the distinctions the outer self, the ideal self, and the real self are meant to capture with greater ontological precision. What none of these frameworks provided was a connection between the personal architecture of the psyche and a transpersonal ground beyond it. Each remained a purely psychological or social account, without an account of the real self's participation in infinite consciousness. This connection, along with a terminological foundation for the for-self architecture rooted directly in the Quranic text, was established in the author's own prior work demonstrating that the Quranic term nafs is most accurately translated as mind or psyche having three different dimensions, and that the related terms kalb, aql, and fayad correspond to dimensions of intelligence, providing the linguistic and textual groundwork from which the present for-self architecture and its connection to infinite consciousness through the real self is developed. For is therefore not a preference or a convention. It is the minimum number of ontological layers required to account for all the irreducible features of human psychological experience that the argument of the preceding sections has established, and the maximum number supportable by the available evidence without introducing unwarranted theoretical complexity. The for-self architecture is not merely a theoretical proposal. It is a logically necessary conclusion from the universal human experience of internal conflict, supported by the entire tradition of psychological conflict theory and confirmable through direct introspection by any human being who examines their own experience with sufficient honesty. Every human being, upon honest introspection, discovers an undeniable fact about their own inner life. They regularly experience opposing thoughts, desires, impulses, and orientations simultaneously within themselves. A person wants to speak truthfully and simultaneously wants to avoid the social discomfort that truth would cause. A person is drawn toward immediate gratification and simultaneously repelled by the consequences of that gratification. A person feels a deep emotional pull in one direction and an equally deep moral resistance in the opposite direction. A person knows what they should do and simultaneously feels what they want to do, and these are not the same thing. This is not an occasional anomaly in human experience. It is a universal and continuous feature of psychological life, recognized across every culture, described in every literary tradition, and documented in every major psychological framework. The logical argument from this universal experience to the for-self architecture is precise and eliminatively necessary. If there were only one self, there could be only one orientation at any given moment. A single unified subject cannot simultaneously want and not want the same thing. It cannot simultaneously be drawn toward and repelled from the same object. It cannot simultaneously evaluate an action as desirable and as wrong. Genuine conflict requires at least two distinct parties with opposing orientations. A person who experiences genuine internal conflict, which is every person who has ever lived, is therefore directly demonstrating through their own experience that they contain multiple distinct experiential centers, multiple selves, each capable of generating its own orientations independently of the others. The psychological literature on conflict provides extensive empirical documentation of this universal experience. Lewin, 1935, was the first to systematize the theory of psychological conflict into three fundamental types. Approach conflict occurs when the person is simultaneously drawn toward two incompatible desirable goals. Approach avoidance conflict occurs when the person is simultaneously attracted to and repelled by the same goal. Avoidance conflict occurs when the person faces two simultaneously undesirable options and must choose between them. Miller, 1944, extended and formalized Lewin's framework, demonstrating through experimental evidence that these conflict types produce measurable behavioral and physiological effects, including vacillation, hesitation, anxiety, and displacement behaviors. Dollard and Miller, 1950, further demonstrated that psychological conflict operates across multiple levels of the person simultaneously, involving biological drives, learned behaviors, social norms, and moral values in complex interaction. The mapping of these conflict types onto the four-self architecture produces a more precise and clinically useful account than any existing conflict theory provides. When the inner self generates an impulse toward immediate gratification, the outer self brings a conflictual argument based on social norms and anticipated social consequences. This is not what is done in this social context. This will damage your social standing. This violates the expectations of the people around you. This conflict between the inner self's appetite and the outer self's social calculation produces the most common form of approach avoidance conflict. The person is attracted to something by the inner self and simultaneously repelled from it by the outer self's social analysis. When both the inner self's desire and the outer self's social analysis point in the same direction, but the ideal self registers moral resistance, a deeper form of approach avoidance conflict arises, one in which the moral dimension of the person's nature opposes both the emotional and the social pull. This is the conflict most associated with guilt, shame, and moral distress. The ideal self's role in this process is not to argue or to prohibit. It evaluates and appreciates. When a balanced resolution is found that respects both the inner self's legitimate needs and the outer self's social realities without violating the ideal self's moral orientation, the ideal self registers appreciation, a sense of rightness, of integrity maintained. When a resolution is reached that violates the ideal self's moral standards, even if it satisfies the inner self's desire and the outer self's social calculation, the ideal self registers discomfort, the guilt and shame that follow morally compromised decisions even when they are functionally successful. The real self's role is categorically different from that of the other three. It does not generate desires like the inner self, does not argue from social norms like the outer self, and does not evaluate from moral standards like the ideal self. It permits or prohibits the actual execution of behavior. Nothing is actually executed without the real self's allowance. This is the element entirely absent from all existing psychological models, and will be discussed later in the book under the theory of hybrid behavior. 7.6. The dominant self, the immediate channel of every who question. The person moves continuously between the four selves. At any given moment, one self is more active, more influential, more determinative of the person's experience and behavior than the others. The self in which the person primarily resides and operates at any given moment is the dominant self. The dominant self is not a fixed property of the person. It shifts continuously depending on the person's circumstances. their emotional state, the social context they are in, their level of spiritual development, and the nature of the demands being made upon them. The dominant self is the immediate and psychologically precise answer to the question of through what every experience, decision, action, thought, and response occurs, though not to the question of who undergoes it, who feels pain at this moment, infinite consciousness, experiencing through whichever self is currently dominant, who makes this decision, infinite consciousness, deciding through the channel the dominant self provides, who acts in this situation, thinks these thoughts, responds to this challenge. In every case, the subject is infinite consciousness. The dominant self is never itself the one who feels, decides, acts, thinks, or responds. It is the specific configuration of the person's psychological architecture that determines the quality of that experiencing at the moment it occurs, its depth, its character, its orientation, without ever becoming the experiencer itself. This distinction between the channel that shapes an experience and the subject that undergoes it is not a trivial one. It is a fundamental insight into the structure of human psychological life that existing psychology has not formulated with this precision, and one the present book insists on with equal precision. Mistaking the dominant self for the subject would collapse exactly the distinction this book has established as most fundamental. When the outer self is dominant, infinite consciousness experiences the world through the lens of the person's social identity, their cultural schemas, their learned beliefs and behavioral patterns. Decisions are socially conditioned, oriented toward social approval and the management of social consequences. Feelings are surface level, filtered through the social persona and expressed in socially appropriate ways. Actions are norm-driven, governed by the expectations of the social environment. The person has access to the consciousness level of awareness, which is the most surface-level encoding of infinite consciousness within the person's architecture. At this level, the person is most separated, phenomenologically, from a sense of the infinite ground, most enclosed within the constructed reality of their social identity, and most vulnerable to the distortions and pathologies that arise from faulty socialization and cultural conditioning. When the inner self is dominant, infinite consciousness experiences the world through the lens of the person's emotional and instinctual nature. Decisions are emotionally driven, governed by immediate desire, attachment, and the urgent need for emotional gratification. Feelings are deep and immediately pressing, arising from the biological substrate of emotional life that all human beings share regardless of culture. Actions are appetite-driven, oriented toward the satisfaction of the inner self's fundamental needs for connection, pleasure, safety, and stimulation. The person has access to the subconsciousness level of awareness. At this level, the experiencing draws closer to the universal ground of human nature, less enclosed within the constructed social persona, but still channeled through a localized configuration shaped by personal emotional history and biological constitution. When the ideal self is dominant, infinite consciousness experiences the world through the lens of the person's moral orientation and aspirational values. Decisions are morally oriented, governed by the person's sense of what is right, what is good, what is worth striving toward. Feelings are aspirational, tinged with the elevating quality that accompanies moral clarity and purposive engagement. Actions are value-driven, oriented toward the realization of the person's highest aspirations for themselves and their contribution to others. The person has access to the subconsciousness level of awareness with moral orientation. At this level, the channel through which infinite consciousness experiences most directly engages the dimension of the person's nature that connects to universal human values, the layer at which individual moral aspiration begins to converge with the broader moral order that infinite consciousness expresses through the collective life of human beings. When the real self is dominant, infinite consciousness experiences the world through the thinnest possible veil between the localized channel and its own infinite ground. Decisions arise from the deepest possible transparency of this channel, reflecting not merely personal desire, social calculation, or moral aspiration, but a more direct expression of infinite consciousness's own participation through the person. Feelings at this level have a quality that is qualitatively different from feelings channeled through the other three configurations. They are marked by a sense of depth, spaciousness, and connection that the other levels cannot produce, a sense of being at home in the ground of existence rather than navigating its surface. Actions at this level arise with a quality of effortlessness and rightness that the person recognizes as different from the effortful navigation of social norms or the driven urgency of emotional appetite. The person has access to the maximum possible transparency of this channel to infinite consciousness within the constraints of their current level of spiritual intelligence and development. The concept of the dominant self also resolves a puzzle that existing psychological frameworks cannot adequately address: why the same person can exhibit radically different qualities of experience, decision, and action in different situations. The conventional response is to appeal to contextual factors, to situational pressures and environmental cues that elicit different behavioral responses. This response correctly identifies that context matters, but does not explain the mechanism through which it matters. The dominant self-concept provides the mechanism. Different contexts activate different selves as dominant, and the qualitative shift in experience, decision, and action that occurs when the dominant self shifts is not merely a change in behavioral response, but a change in the specific channel through which the one subject, infinite consciousness, experiences. The person who makes a decision from outer self-dominance and the same person who makes a decision from real self-dominance are not merely responding differently to the same contextual cues. Infinite consciousness is operating through different layers of the same person's ontological architecture, generating qualitatively different forms of experience as a result, without ever ceasing to be the one and only subject undergoing them. 7.7. The behavioral execution process, the complete architecture of agency. Psychology, to date, has not identified a complete account of how behavior is actually executed. Across more than a century of theorizing, no framework has provided a comprehensive account of how behavior is actually formed and executed. Each has instead illuminated one dimension of the process while leaving the mechanism of execution itself unaddressed. Classical conditioning and behaviorism explain how associations and reinforcement shape behavioral responses, but say nothing about what determines whether a formed response is actually executed on a given occasion. Social learning theory explains how behavior is acquired through observation and imitation, and cognitive theory explains how mental structures and social interaction shape behavior, but neither specifies the mechanism by which a cognitively represented behavior converts into actual execution. The theory of reasoned action and its successor, the theory of planned behavior, identify intention as the proximal predictor of behavior and incorporate perceived behavioral control, attitude, and subjective norms. Yet a meta-analysis of this tradition confirms what practitioners of the theory have long acknowledged. Intention consistently and substantially underpredicts actual behavior, leaving a gap the theory itself cannot close. Kuhl's action control theory and its extension, personality systems interaction theory, add the role of emotion and competing action impulses in determining whether an intention survives to execution, while action regulation theory models the cognitive regulation of goal setting, planning, execution, and feedback. And action identification theory describes how the perceived meaning of an action sustains or undermines its pursuit. More recent frameworks extend the search further outward. The theory of active inference models behavior as the minimization of variational free energy relative to an organism's predictions about the world, and social exchange theory situates behavior within networks of reciprocal social obligation. Each of these 12 traditions captures something real and important about behavior: association, reinforcement, imitation, cognition, intention, control, emotion, regulation, meaning, inference, and social exchange. And yet none identifies a final, decisive mechanism at which a behavior is either permitted or withheld, independent of the strength of whatever precedes it: intention, habit, emotion, or inferential prediction. The theory of hybrid behavior, developed as a subsidiary framework of Wadat al-Khail, integrates the natural, nurtural, and supernatural factors that existing theories have addressed only in isolation. Behavior, on this account, is defined broadly to include not just doing something, but refraining from an action or simply observing, a definition wide enough to capture the full range of what a person actually does. The theory identifies 3 categories of influence acting on behavior simultaneously: natural agents, neurological processes, emotions and desires; nurtural agents, society and culture; and supernatural agents, God and the devil, as understood across religious traditions. On this basis, the theory explicitly rejects the notion of absolute free will, proposing instead that most human action is reactive to these 3 intertwined influences rather than the product of purely autonomous choice, while still acknowledging a limited domain of freedom in feeling and observation. What the theory identifies as genuinely free human action is specifically that which is unaffected by these omnipresent environmental and supernatural forces, a narrower category than what everyday intuition treats as free choice. In contrast to behavioral, cognitive, and social theories that model human autonomy and control as though they operated in a closed system, the theory of hybrid behavior insists that a complete account of behavior cannot omit either the environmental or the supernatural dimension, offering a genuinely interdisciplinary framework with direct implications for psychology, neuroscience, sociology, religious studies, and philosophy. The four-self model gives this integration its precise architecture. It is not merely a static description of the person's psychological structure, but a dynamic account of how behavior is generated, how decisions are made, and how the subject of experience operates within the process of action. The present section describes that process in detail, drawing out its implications for the question of the ultimate subject. The behavioral process begins with sensation, which is not a simple sensory input, but a complex integration point that spans all layers of the person's architecture simultaneously. Sensation receives inputs from 5 distinct sources at once: biological inputs from the physique, the body's neurological and hormonal state; neurological inputs from the unconsciousness layer, including the pre-programmed responses encoded in the person's biological coding; emotional and desire inputs from the subconsciousness layer, reflecting the inner self's current motivational state; social and cultural inputs from the consciousness layer, reflecting the outer self's learned schemas and social awareness; and divine commandment inputs entering at the unconsciousness level, reflecting the participation of infinite consciousness in the person's experiential process from the very beginning of the behavioral sequence. Sensation is therefore not the passive reception of environmental stimuli. It is the active convergence of biological, emotional, social, and divine influences into a single integrated experiential event that initiates the behavioral process. From sensation, the process moves horizontally within the consciousness layer through 3 sequential stages that constitute the active cognitive processing of the person's experience. Perception follows sensation. The raw integrated sensory event is filtered through the person's existing schemas, memories, beliefs, and interpretive frameworks to produce a meaningful representation of the situation. What the person perceives is not what is objectively present, but what their existing cognitive architecture makes of what is objectively present, filtered through the lens of the outer self's second nature. Intelligence follows perception. The meaningful representation produced by perception is processed by the person's cognitive intelligence, evaluated, analyzed, and subjected to the reasoning capacities available at the consciousness level. The quality of this processing depends directly on the person's level of cognitive intelligence. Higher cognitive intelligence produces more accurate, nuanced, and adaptive processing. Lower cognitive intelligence produces more distorted, rigid, and maladaptive processing. Simultaneously with this conscious processing sequence, intention is formed at the subconsciousness level and feeds downward into the sequence between intelligence and the outer self's will. Intention is not a product of conscious deliberation alone. It arises from the subconsciousness, from the convergence of the inner self's emotional drives and the ideal self's moral orientation, and enters the conscious processing sequence as a motivational force that shapes the direction of intelligent processing before the outer self's will is formed. This is precisely what the Libet experiments documented at the neural level. The intention is already forming at a level below conscious awareness before the outer self's conscious experience of deciding arises. The outer self's will is the product of this entire processing sequence, the result of sensation integrated across all levels, filtered through perception, processed by intelligence, and shaped by intention from the subconsciousness. It represents the outer self's determination of what should be done, the conscious deliberative conclusion of the person's processing. But the outer self's will is not the final determinant of behavior. It is necessary but not sufficient. It must be submitted upward to, and permitted by, the will of infinite consciousness, represented in the behavioral execution diagram as God's will in the universal consciousness layer at the top of the architecture. The convergence of the outer self's will with the will of infinite consciousness is the act of behavioral execution. Behavior occurs at the boundary between consciousness and physique, the point at which psychological process becomes physical event, where the mental touches the biological and produces an action in the world. This convergence is the critical insight that the behavioral execution model provides and that no existing psychological framework has previously articulated. The ultimate executive of human behavior is not the outer self. It is the real self operating at the interface with infinite consciousness, the final gate through which the will of infinite consciousness either permits or prohibits the execution of the behavior that the outer self's processing has proposed. This architecture has a profound implication for the question of free will that existing debates have consistently missed. The human being has genuine deliberative freedom within the consciousness layer. The outer self genuinely processes, evaluates, and forms a will regarding what should be done. But the execution of that will is contingent on its alignment with the will of infinite consciousness. The person is genuinely free in their deliberation. They are not the sole author of their action. They are the proximate cause. Infinite consciousness is the ultimate cause, the final gate through which all behavior must pass. This is not determinism in the conventional sense, which eliminates the person's deliberative freedom entirely. It is what might be called participatory agency. The person genuinely participates in the determination of their own behavior through the full depth of their psychological architecture. But this participation occurs within and is ultimately governed by the infinite whole within which the person exists as a localized thought. The person's freedom is real but relative, genuine but not absolute, participatory rather than sovereign. Infinite consciousness enters the behavioral process at both ends. At the beginning, through divine commandment inputs into the unconsciousness layer that shape the pre-programmed foundations of the person's behavioral repertoire. And at the end, through the will of infinite consciousness that permits or prohibits the execution of the behavior the outer self has proposed. The person's conscious processing occurs between these two expressions of infinite consciousness's involvement within a field that is bounded on both sides by the infinite ground. The subject of the behavioral process is therefore not the outer self alone, not the I that experiences itself as the deliberating agent, not even the dominant self in isolation. The full subject of every human behavioral event is infinite consciousness, experiencing through the person as a whole, with the real self as the interface through which this participation in the infinite ground is most directly expressed. 7.8 Intelligence, Wisdom, and the Quality of Selfhood. Each self generates its own form of intelligence, and the quality of that intelligence determines both the quality of the experience that the dominant self produces and the health or illness of the corresponding domain of psychosocial life. This relationship between intelligence, selfhood, and health is the clinical heart of the present framework and represents the most practically significant application of the ontological architecture developed in the preceding subsections. The 8 intelligences described in the author's holistic model of wisdom correspond precisely to the 4 selves. Basic intelligence and cognitive intelligence correspond to the outer self's processing capacity within the consciousness layer. Sexual intelligence and emotional intelligence correspond to the inner self's processing capacity within the subconsciousness layer. Moral intelligence corresponds to the ideal self's evaluative capacity within the subconsciousness layer. Spiritual intelligence corresponds to the real self's connective capacity at the boundary with infinite consciousness. The remaining intelligences, social intelligence, environmental intelligence, and religious intelligence, correspond to specific dimensions of the outer self's engagement with the social, physical, and ultimate concern dimensions of the person's environment. The clinical formula that emerges from this architecture is elegant and precise. High intelligence in any domain produces wellness in the corresponding domain of psychosocial health. Low intelligence in any domain produces illness in the corresponding domain. This formula is not a simplification. It is a logically exact expression of the relationship between the quality of each self's processing and the quality of the experience that processing generates. When the inner self has high emotional intelligence, it can process, express, and regulate its emotional experience appropriately, generating emotional wellness. When it has low emotional intelligence, it cannot process its emotional experience adequately, generating emotional illness in the specific forms that arise from the specific ways in which emotional processing fails. Suppression, dysregulation, emotional avoidance, or emotional flooding. The causal chain from interself conflict to mental disorder is now precisely traceable within this framework. The inner self generates an impulse toward gratification. The outer self brings a conflictual argument from social norms. The ideal self evaluates from a moral standpoint. The real self permits or prohibits execution. When this interself conflict is resolved with sufficient intelligence at all relevant levels, the conflict produces growth. The person learns from the tension between their different natures and develops a more integrated, wise, and aligned way of being. When the conflict is not resolved with sufficient intelligence, the unresolved tension produces distress. This distress, if persistent and unresolved, accumulates into disorder. In Freudian terms, the unresolved impulse of the inner self, blocked by the outer self's social arguments or the real self's prohibition, undergoes repression, being pushed below the level of conscious awareness rather than processed and integrated. The repressed content does not disappear. It persists in the subconsciousness and generates symptoms, the distorted expressions of unprocessed emotional content that constitute the phenomenology of psychological disorder. In Maslow's terms, the non-gratification of the fundamental needs associated with the inner self, for safety, connection, esteem, and self-actualization, produces a state of deficiency motivation that consumes the person's psychological resources and prevents movement toward higher levels of functioning. The person becomes stuck, unable to progress, because the unmet need at a deeper level continuously demands attention and resources. The specific disorder that develops from unresolved interself conflict depends on which self is in conflict, which intelligence is deficient, and which domain of health is therefore compromised, as the author's psychosocial health model depicts with clinical precision. Low emotional intelligence produces emotional illness in its various forms. Anxiety, depression, emotional dysregulation, attachment difficulties, and the full range of disorders, in which the inability to process emotional experience adaptively is the central mechanism. Low social intelligence produces social illness. Social anxiety, personality disorders characterized by interpersonal dysfunction, and the various forms of psychopathology in which the inability to navigate social relationships with competence and autonomy is the primary dysfunction. Low moral intelligence produces moral illness. The erosion of ethical coherence, moral confusion, the inability to act with integrity under pressure, and the various forms of psychopathology in which the disconnection between values and behavior is the central mechanism. Low spiritual intelligence produces spiritual illness. Existential emptiness, meaninglessness, depersonalization, and the deepest forms of psychopathology in which the disconnection from the ground of being is most directly expressed. The cross-cultural universality of these 8 domains of health and illness is itself significant evidence for the ontological rather than culturally constructed character of the four-self architecture. Every human culture has concepts of emotional health, moral health, social health, and spiritual health. Every culture has recognized that human beings can suffer in these specific ways and has developed frameworks, whether religious, philosophical, or psychological, for understanding and addressing that suffering. This cross-cultural universality is precisely what the four-self model predicts. If the architecture is ontological rather than culturally constructed, if it reflects the actual structure of the human person as a thought of infinite consciousness, then the health domains that arise from its proper or improper functioning should be recognizable across all cultures and historical periods. Wisdom in this framework is not a separate faculty or a distinct dimension of the person's psychology. It is the quality of the person's functioning across all 8 domains of intelligence simultaneously. The wise person is not merely one who reasons well, or one who regulates emotions skillfully, or one who acts with moral integrity. The wise person is one whose dominant self moves fluidly across all 4 selves with sufficient intelligence at each level to process experience, resolve conflict, and maintain alignment with the deeper layers of the self, and ultimately with infinite consciousness. Wisdom is the integrated expression of all 8 intelligences in service of the person's fullest possible participation in the ground of their own being. It is not a static achievement, but a dynamic ongoing process, the process of progressively aligning the dominant self with the real self, and through the real self with infinite consciousness.